Hello, my bookish lovelies, Kara here, and today I'm going to be talking about a book that NetGalley actually gave me as an ARC. It's coming out on September 7th, 2021. It's called Certain Dark Things by Silviamorenogarcia, and I'm really excited to talk about this one because this completely rewrote vampire lore as we know it. It's basically been described as neo-noir vampire book written in an alternative version of Mexico City, and it does follow several perspectives. Alt is our main character, and she's a type of vampire that when she feeds, she actually kind of gets wings and like, you know, like those like little things like that butterflies kind of use like to suck stuff out of. Basically like that's what she uses to feed on other people. Also, her eyes turn red when she hasn't fed for a while. It's kind of interesting, like this book, I'm a huge fan of vampires in general. If you guys have been around on this channel for a while, you guys know I love vampires. So when I saw this book, like I just absolutely had to request it. That first example of our main character Alt as a vampire is one of many examples of how there are like, this world has different types of vampires. I liked it because I felt like there was a variety of vampires in this, like not just one type. You have several different types, and it's great because like it gives you kind of variety, but it also kind of makes the playing field for these vampires who, you know, kind of like don't like each other way more interesting like than your average like vampire book who has all the same vampires with all the same capabilities, and it just makes things super interesting. So at the beginning we meet this guy named Domingo, who is a subway garbage collector, and basically like what he does is like he is kind of homeless. He's got like a place like where he stays, but he actually like goes through and he meets Alt, our main character, on a subway, and she offers him some money to kind of like go off and feed on him. Now in Mexico City, being a vampire is completely illegal. They actually have been hunting people who are vampires, and vampires are actually outlawed in Mexico City. So if there's a vampire in there, they kind of flew under the radar and they somehow managed to get into Mexico City, but they're not wanted there. And if they're found there, they will be killed. So in this book, our main character is searching for a way to get out of Mexico City because she's on the run. Her entire class of vampires have been hunted, and it's really difficult for her because like her mother's dead, like basically most of her family members are dead, and she feels personally responsible of something that happened like, you know, several years ago. So she's actually just trying to figure out a way like to get out of Mexico City, and she recruits Domingo to kind of help her do that because her class of vampire can actually walk in the sunlight. However, it is very draining for her to do so. We meet another character in this that kind of is helping Alt, and he was a friend of Alt's mother who was a priestess of her vampire tribe. This Bernardo is amazing. He's actually my favorite vampire, like this whole thing. He's part of a class called Revenant, and they are a European vampire that can gobble both humans and vampires, but he is kind of like our resident psychic vampire. So all the vampires in this world age, but they age so slowly that like it takes them like hundreds of years to get like to their full maturity and to actually like get to elderly years. What's really interesting about Bernardo though, my favorite one, is that he is feared by vampires because he is a revenant. A revenant basically is this vampire like that if he touches you, it doesn't matter if you're human or if you're a vampire, you will have the life sucked out of you, and it actually makes Bernardo, a revenant, much younger. Now he gets more life force off of vampires because, you know, like they have more life force to give than he does humans, but vampires are actually scared of him too because he's not just a threat to humans, he's a threat to vampires too. Then you have another class that they kind of discuss in here, it's necros. And they can eat food and drink, which none of the other vampires can do. If they feed on a human, they gain control of them. It's almost like the necros are like, they're like the ones like with all like the nasty like STD type things, because if you sleep with one or if they feed on you, you become kind of a mindless like drone for a while, while like whatever is going on like with whatever their blood carries kind of sucks the life out of you until you're dead. Or they kill you. One of the two. And actually like the necros are also closer to what you would consider a traditional vampire. They have serrated fangs, sharp neck muscles to pull the skin. Like when they feed, like it is messy. They just like rip their victim open. Like it is violent. So it's very interesting like to see like that there's all these different ways. Now the interesting thing about like this book is like there is a glossary at the back, which I didn't know when I started this book. But there are way more vampires in this world than just those 3 classes. But they reference them, but they don't really get into talking about them. These are just the main types that they really like focus on in this particular book. So as Alt, our main character, is trying to leave the city, she is being hunted by Godoy. So Godoy is actually a necro, and his son Nicholas, who is also a necro, is hunting Alt. Now, I also want to say too, in this world, vampires are not created, which is another difference like between like traditional vampire lore and this book. This book actually says that you were born into being a vampire, but you cannot become one. Alt's species of vampire, actually, they are able to create what they call Renfields, which I was really kind of interested that they use that terminology, because that's actually like a reference to Bram Stoker's Dracula, when Dracula had a kind of an assistant that they named Renfield. And in Dracula, like, it made Renfields out to be kind of crazy and obsessed and just somebody like to do their bidding. Well, in this book, Renfields are somebody to do the bidding. However, they are also not mindless. They are just kind of like friends, and they're bonded through blood to whatever vampire, you know, drinks their blood and exchanges like a little bit for their own. Now, all species, if they exchange blood, it doesn't hurt their person like it does with the necros. But what it does do is it kind of connects them, and they can kind of like share imagery and dreams, and like they're actually almost psychically connected to their Renfield when they share blood. I loved it because in this, Domingo, the garbage collector, becomes Alt's Renfield, and we kind of got to see like that whole dynamic in action, and I really appreciated that because like it just made something about like their connection like a little bit more intimate. And there was a minor romance in this book, but I wouldn't say like that it dominated the plot. It was kind of like more like in the background. A lot of like what the monitoring is, like this book kind of gave me like COVID flashbacks like a little bit, because this is an alternate view of Mexico City, but there was a plague a while back, and they don't know like whether or not it was made at a lab or the vampires kind of brought it up. So like that's like one of the reasons like also like why like they're not like why humans in a lot of these cities are not like much into vampires, because there was a plague and it makes people really, really sick. There's actually a group like that actually goes like around and kind of screens people and makes sure like that they're not vampires, but also make sure like they're not sick, because if they're sick they need to get tested and then quarantined. So there's actually like kind of like a background. And if you guys want more information like on that also, I also suggest like if you guys are interested in that, like making sure you guys go to the glossary, because in the book itself, in the text, it does not explain very much at all about what is going on with that, but the glossary in the back actually does go into more detail about like the sickness and like the symptoms and like why it's a threat and kind of like, you know, when it happened and everything else. So like I did find at the end of the book the glossary very helpful to this. Overall, like this book felt extremely fast-paced. It was loaded with a ton of mythology for vampires. It had a ton of details to pay attention to, and many intricate, important details to the plot line that kind of like were kind of sporadic throughout it. I almost wish that there wasn't a glossary for this. I understand kind of like why there was a glossary for this, because like I feel like if they had dumped all of this information like into the plot itself, it would have been too wordy, it would have been an info dump. And so I can kind of understand like why she put the information like in the glossary at the end of the book, but at the same time I would have liked to have like gotten like more fleshed out world in this, because I feel like it was so important, like, you know, like almost like to kind of like integrate. I think I would have actually liked like a little bit more wordiness in this, just to get like a taste of like more of like how the virus is factoring in like to everything, and you know like all of the other species of vampires that were only kind of briefly mentioned in this. And I'm really hoping like that this is going to be like the first of many books like in this, because this was so fascinating to me as somebody who's interested in vampire lore, as having multiple strains of vampires like that do like different things. To me, like this novel, as far as vampire lore goes, was a breath of fresh air, because it was just so different. It felt very different from many other of the vampire books that I read because of how each class of vampire was described. And I loved how it was all done. The other thing too is like I ended up falling in love with these characters, like especially Bernardo. He was incredible. I actually, if silviamorenogarcia is like, you know, listening, I would love for her to do a prequel for just Bernardo. And I want to explore like his race and like I want to meet more of his kind. And to me, like he was like just like the powerhouse of like vampires. So I don't like really feel like we got enough time with these characters because this book like is really only like about 272 pages, I think. And a good portion of that towards the end is the glossary. I felt like that we should have had more expansion like on the past and like on the things that were going on in this book. In a lot of ways, like this book was super satisfying because like of all of like the differences like between like this and other vampire books, but at the same time, it left me wanting more and asking more questions and wanting to be immersed in more of this. And I think like the fact that I'm so thirsty for more actually like knocked down like my rating like a little bit because like I just do not feel like super satisfied with what I got because this was so, like I said, the portion of this like that was like the vampires and everything else was super satisfying, but it wasn't satisfying like in the way like that I felt like that there was enough of it. I felt like we should have gone like more like into detail like with the characters. I mean, we could have even, you know, like since we had like some recollection of like Bernardo himself, like it would have been really cool like to see like him do like flashbacks of like where he came from and kind of like dig more like into his vampire lore and just kind of, you know, like know more about him. I would have liked to have learned more about Nicholas's father, Godoy, who was a necro, and we didn't like really like Godoy in this book wasn't even hardly mentioned. He was pretty much like a side character like that came up a few times, and they spoke to him on the phone like once or twice to kind of give him an update of how their hunting for Alt was going. And it's kind of like a messy situation because Godoy and Alt like kind of had a confrontation, and so Godoy is actually like the one who killed most of Alt's family, so they kind of have this old rivalry, and Nicholas is dying to make sure that he sinks his fangs into her, kind of like his like, you know, stooge, because the necros can actually affect other vampires if they're bitten with that kind of like vampire STD kind of thing that they have going on. I really hope like that we get more from this world. I know like in Goodreads like that it is described as a standalone, but overall like I feel like this was a 4 out of 5 stars for me because I just wanted so much more from it. I wanted to be like so much more immersed like with the characters, and because like there was so much detail, I felt like it was fast-paced, but we glossed over so much that I would have loved to have seen like more worked into the storyline and how things like were, you know, like working out. I do not feel like the world itself was fleshed out enough. I wanted it to be like fuller. I wanted like to see like more of an array of things. I wanted it to dig deeper, and I don't feel like we got that from this book. But it was super enjoyable, and I really liked it, and I thought like that the characters and the vampires and everything else were just so fascinating. So I do highly recommend this, and I do think it's definitely worth the time it takes to read it, because as somebody like, if you're like really into vampires and you're like really like into the mythology and stuff like that, I definitely think that you would enjoy this. So I hope you guys liked this review. I feel like I was all over the place with this review, but there was just so much to say about the book, and I feel like I said most of like what my thoughts were on it without going like too much like into the storyline, because the storyline is actually like part of like what makes this book so interesting to me. And I didn't like want to like, you know, ruin anything if you do decide to read this. I did definitely want to make this spoiler free, but like I definitely do recommend this highly if you guys are interested in vampires or like silviamorenogarcia or anything like that. So thank you guys so much for joining me. If you guys like this video, hit the little like, hit subscribe, hit the icon if you guys want to receive emails every single time I post. I'm also on Amazon, Goodreads, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Those links are linked in the description below, and I will see you guys again very soon.